For Emerson, when we started to make beach chairs, I used to make the top, not to put on the chairs, to sew on the sewing machine.
Right. Okay. And what was it like working at Emerson?
Pardon me?
How were the working conditions?
Very good.
Were they good?
Very good to me, no kick, Yeah. They want to rough on us.
Right.
As with the brickyards, not only did residents from rural areas of New Hampshire come to work in these mills, so did French Canadians, like Mrs. Duford's father. Actually, immigrants came from all over the world to toil in New England mills, and they often stayed to become American citizens. It could be a lonely and hard life for them.
My mother worked in the mills, the fabric mill. My mother worked there until she was 80, well, in her 80s. And she and my aunt, they did cutting. They were in a cutting mill where you cut the patterns, And this mill, it was the Elliott, I think it was, silk mill. And this mill opened up one up north somewhere. And they wanted my mother, now in her 80s, and my aunt to go up there and teach those people because they were so good at their work. But my mother was brought up in England. She came from England. When she was 18, my mother came over to this country all alone. She left her whole family and everybody because there was no work in England in the mills, the kind of work she did. And these people that I were named for, the Parkinsons, they had come from England too. They were good friends with my mother's family. They came from England and they settled in Manchester. So they said my mother would have a place to stay if she came. So she came alone and she went into Boston, and I think Grandpa Dick met her anyway, and they brought her up to Manchester. But she wasn't, well, she went to work in the mills, but she wasn't in this country, I don't think, much more than a month when they went back to England to visit. Now my mother, 18 or 19, not knowing anybody, all alone in this country. And she lost so much weight. She was just sick inside. And she said the only way I could stand it was every payday I put so much aside and said, well, this is growing. When it gets big enough, I can go back home. Well, by the time Grandpa and Grammy, I used to call them Grandpa and Grammy, by the time they came back and they saw the condition my mother was in, Grammy said, we never would have gone if we had known, But when they got back, and she almost had enough money to go home, she started to go with them. See, I had aunts that worked in that mill, and they were very friendly with the Parkinsons. So for a weekend or a Sunday, they'd come up to the farm. And that's how my mother met my father, on the farm.
One of the jobs which men volunteered for was to help fight what was a constant threat, fire. Large numbers of buildings met their ends in fire. In the 1930s and 40s, professional fire departments only existed in large cities. Elsewhere, in places like Hooksett, local men were expected to volunteer for this vital service. While it often was fun and a way to meet friends, firefighting could also be very dangerous, as some young volunteers discovered.
In fact, I was only 14 or 15 and belonged to the volunteer fire department at that time.
Did you? Yeah.
Yes.
Now, how did they get in touch with you if they needed you?
The siren would ring.
Oh.
And within the siren was a number of beeps that would tell you approximately where the fire was.
Oh, really? The area of town?
And you'd all run for the fire station. The first ones on the truck were the first ones to drive the truck, incidentally.
Oh.
So there was a great effort to get there first so we could drive the truck out, which very seldom started unless it was pushed out.
Oh, no. So did this fire department respond just to Lincoln Park, mostly?
No, occasionally village too, if it was a fire serious enough that it would require both fire departments.
Oh.
Most of the time just just the Lincoln Park section, right.
So it was pretty interesting that they let young boys help out.
Yes, I remember going to a fire one time. I got up on the roof first. The flames were coming through the roof. And I had a tank with me or a hose with me, and I had to call down and say, how the heck do you run this thing anyway? I had to ask instructions how to use the hose properly.
While you were up on the roof?
While I'm up on the roof.
Pretty exciting.
It was exciting, it was fun. Back in those days, it was great fun. Major fires in the town of Hooksett. It was what do they call a grass fire, or a woods fire, not a home. It started from coal from the passing trains that went down the railroad track by the river. And it started a fire across the street from the Indian Cliff cabins. And I had gone into the woods with a pony tank on my back to fight fire. I was 14, 15 years old, I think, at the time. And I went in with an experienced man. They would only allow us to go in with an experienced firefighter. This guy was the name of Vutz, who was a firefighter. It turned out to be a major conflagration. And as we approached the fire line, the firemen and I, there was a burst of flames coming through the upper branches of the pine trees right towards us. And he said, "Get out of here quick." So I started running with the pony tank. He ran in one direction, I ran in the other. And later on, I kept running back into the fire line, After a while, I dropped off the tank because it was heavy on my back, full of water. It was just a little pumping type thing that you use for brush fires. And I ended up back at the river. But in the meantime, other firemen who were fighting fire from the front side, from the Indian Cliff cabin side, ran across my tank, which was burnt up. And Mr. Vutz got seriously burnt in the fire. He was on the danger list for a number of days. So it was thought that I was perished in the fire, that I died in the fire. I fought fire along the line, finally went back to the river and down a steep slope on my backside, mostly slid down the steep slope to the riverside, to the railroad track, the river right across the street, and I went into the river to try to cool myself off a bit, and I was all scratched up from having to run so furiously, trying to get away from the flames. In the meantime, there's guys on a pushcart, other firefighters from the village, coming up on the pushcart to fight fire, backfire. It burnt all the woods all the way through to Bear Brook Park. Major fire. One of the major fires, as far as I know, the largest fire ever, brush fire ever in the town of Hooksett.
So
But anyway, I ran back into some of my mates after spending hours fighting fire back with the firefighters coming from the backside of the fire. And they all were surprised to see me, thinking I had died in the fire.
Yeah.
Later on, I wrote about this story in high school. What did you do last summer type of thing. What did you do last summer? So I tried to explain the story as best I could in written form to the teacher, and the teacher didn't quite believe it. She thought I had a heck of an imagination.
The job of most children back in the 1930s and 40s was the same as today, school. But schooling back then was different in many ways from today. Several schools of Hooksett were small, and it was typical for children to have only 4 or 5 other kids in their class. Therefore, teachers were expected to teach several grades in the same room.
7 schools in Hooksett at that time.
Were they all,
One on Hackett Hill, one down here on 3A. There was one way up on Misery Hill. There was that one at Lincoln Park. They were situated all through the town. They were all little schools. And they were situated.
all went 1 through 8 in your neighborhood.
In your neighborhood. And then when we graduated, we all gathered at the Odd Fellows Hall in the village. All the schools from Hooksett, yes. But in my own school, when I graduated, there were only 4 of us in the 8th grade.
Wow.
So you see, each school might have had 4 or 5 children. So you got 25 or 30 children graduating when they graduated. We graduated all together. But that was the only time that I ever saw some of them. And some of them, that was the only time they ever came to the village. Because other than coming to vote or something like that, we lived right there in South Hooksett. Our school, when we went from the little school to the Martin's Corner one, where the Deerhead Sports Club is now, that was our school. There were 3 rooms, and we thought, boy, we were something. Each, still 4 in a room, 4 classes, but that extra room gave us a chance. Like, she'd take some of us girls, and she'd let us go in there, and she and some of the parents, they taught us how to sew. I remember making an apron, and I was so proud of that apron. And then we had art classes in there.
So there were only art classes in 3 of the rooms, and the 4th one was...
There were only in 2 of the rooms. So this 3rd room, and then after I got out of there, of course, they had so many children, they had to use the extra room. But when I went there, that extra room was for special things.
Wow.
Yeah.
So sewing, you said?
Yeah, she taught us how to sew, just little things, you know, but still how to thread a needle and...
Yeah. Now, what was it like having 4 grades in a room? How did the teacher...
Well, you'd, if you were going to have math, your grade, she would have given the other grades something maybe where they had to, for history, where they were looking up things, so when they came front for their class, she divided it up. And every morning we would have, we'd repeat the Lord's Prayer and salute the flag, always. And then we would start with classes. But every day, like after lunch, the first thing, we'd have a spelling bee. The class would divide, and you'd try to beat whoever, you know, stayed up longest. And you'd do everything you could to keep your side up there. And then she'd throw math out at us, even if it was beyond us. 5th grade, she might throw something from 8th grade out so that they would like it. Or then she'd throw something that we could do too. But you'd be surprised how fast you learn. So spelling and math. And she would pick a novel, a really good book that maybe we wouldn't have had a chance because we had no library down there, only what she could do for us. And she would bring a novel. And after lunch, she opened with that book, and she might read us 2 chapters before we had to start to work.
The program was at school. You see, the desks took up the whole room, so there was no auditorium or cafeteria room or anything like that where you could put a lot of people.
Right.
In fact, we didn't have a lunchroom. We ate at our desks, and I think we had the first hot lunch program that Hooksett ever had.
Oh, really?
Well, the furnace was an old coal furnace, and in front of the firebox was a pretty good shelf. It must have been, maybe 1.5 feet wide. And we'd take a potato, for instance, and we'd carve our initials in it so we'd know which one was ours. And when we got to school, we'd put it on that. By noontime, the potato was done, and that was our lunch to go with other things that we may have taken. And Felicia and I used to make hot cocoa to drink, and we did that on top of the stove, a pan on top of that furnace. I don't know how that worked. Too long ago.
Was the school that you went to, the Catholic school, was it divided up by gender? Was it like all girls?
No, it was both girls and boys, but the first grade, baby grade, they used to call it baby grade, and to the 4th grade was down downstairs, and upstairs was the higher grades.
Do you guys get taught by like nuns and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, nuns. We had nuns that used to take the bus and come down here from Suncook, from the convent in Suncook. We had no convent here. They had the nuns used to come from Suncook over here.
And did they have like really strict rules at all?
Well, yeah, they were strict. You know, you had to, you know, like anything else, but they could use the ruler on your hand.
Yeah, my mom went to Catholic school. She said
She did too?
Yeah, she had to deal with that.
Yeah, but of course, then there was no more. The flood took down the building.